Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Okay, great. And hopefully everybody can hear me in the room, maybe?
Hi, Dr. Adams. I don't know what's happening, but we can't hear you over here.
Oh, okay,
So I'm gonna try to get that fixed in just a second.
that's okay. So if you can't fix it, that's all right. You can let Dr. Page do his introduction.
I don't know if you guys can hear.
I we can hear you, but there's like an echo. Yeah. Yeah. If you just want to, yeah, because of your audio, I got it. Yep. So if you can just if you want to let Dr. Page to know to just do the introduction, then we can just do it like that. Okay.
You can start your introduction.
My turn?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Larry Page. I'm the curator of the fish collection at the Florida Museum of Natural History here on campus. And I was the speaker for the presentation today. I was her PhD advisor, and so I'm very happy to introduce her and to introduce her seminar. Elizabeth Martin is a biologist who has worked in science and biodiversity information positions for most of her career. She has worked with the federal government, the U.S. federal government, for over 2 decades, including positions with the National Science Foundation, the U.S. Department of State, and the U.S. Geological Survey. Her work at the U.S. Geological Survey, where she is now employed, centers on aggregating, standardizing, and providing access to biodiversity and ecosystems data at a national level. And most recently, she's been working on the national database for species of greatest conservation need. So that sounds like a really interesting job to me. Elizabeth was born in Peru. She grew up in Puerto Rico, earned a bachelor's degree in biology from the University of Puerto Rico and a master's degree in biological sciences from Florida State University. She graduated this summer with a PhD from the University of Florida, and the PhD was in interdisciplinary ecology as a student here in the School of Natural Resources and Environment. Her dissertation topic was on the reuse of species occurrence data and use of online databases, which is her topic for today. So the exact title, as you can see, is comparing use of species occurrence data and online databases by academic and government professionals in the United States.
Thank you, Larry. Can everybody hear me okay? I hope yes. Well, today, as Larry mentioned, I'm actually going to present about the research that I conducted for my dissertation on the use of species occurrence data and online databases by professionals in the United States. So I'll start by providing an introduction. Oh, I'm not sure. Okay, there we go. Now we go. So I'll start by providing an introduction on the topic. And, just to start with, there has long been assumed that lack of access to data really impedes science. And because of these, over the past several decades, 2 to 3 decades, really, national governments and international organizations have provided a lot of funding and conducted activities to really digitize data and make it accessible out there. And now with the advent of the internet and also mobile technologies, there's a lot of data collection efforts, not only by scientists, but also by non-scientists. And all this amount of information is being, it's being aggregated and made available over the internet. And we now are into the realm of big data, where there's a lot of information and data that exists out there. But one of the assumptions, for all this digitization and data sharing activities that have gone on for the past few decades has been that really data accessibility translates into data reuse or use of those data that are made available online. And that in turn will translate into research and decision making, into their use, into those realms, basically. But some research actually has found that that may not necessarily be as straightforward as we once thought it was. And data access not always translates into data reuse or into their use in research. And there's been some papers, I guess, some of the recent ones here, Bishop et al. 2019, they were looking at metadata. And what they were finding was that some of the data is being made accessible out there, but people may not be actually using some of those data. And, it could be because of various reasons, right? They don't understand the metadata. They're not looking at it. They're not sure where to look. So there's a variety of reasons. And Ten appeared all in 2020. Also, they did a survey of, scientists, and environmental data. And again, the same thing, although people had thought that, not having access to that impedes their research, actually, when they were asking the researchers, only like half, 50% of them said that that was actually an impediment. So again, there's different things like that. And, basically I guess the point here is that access does not always equate to use and use in research, for example. The other important thing here is that different data user communities are using this data. So just because one community understands and provides the information in the way they feel it works for them, may not really translate into how other user communities use those data. What has been transpiring over the last 6 to 10 years is that people are realizing, at least in the biodiversity and bioinformatics community, that we really need to try to make the data more usable. And from there, the FAIR principles emerge of trying to make the data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. But a lot of that has been also focused on machine actionable data. And one of the things that we really also need to explore is, the human aspects, the social science, the behavioral aspects of those users. And that is really the impetus for some of my research. And just to give you some background on that really helped inform my research, there's really been two disciplines that have really dealt with this. One is library science, and the other one is information technology science. In library science, there has been a long tradition of studying, data and information seeking. There's, really close to 100 years of information on that. And, since the 1950s, people have also focused on, how are scientists looking for data? How do they find data, for example? And then over the last 20 plus years too, there has also been some impetus on data use and data reuse. And I'll provide a definition for data reuse in a second, though. But a lot of that impetus was really on data sharing. Again, because of these large national, efforts to digitize data and share it, there was a lot of information and a lot of work put into data sharing. There's also been some studies, of course, on data access and data evaluation. But the impetus for a lot of what was done over the past decades was really on the sharing of data, just to make it accessible. And in the library sciences, the focus has really been on the content rather than the delivery method. And a lot of that research has been very practical. It usually has application and has focused really on academic researches. Now, the other coin is information technology science, and they have done a lot of modeling on technology acceptance, system acceptance. And the technology acceptance model is a very, widely known model from that discipline, where they're really trying to predict what makes a system accepted. What are the predictors? The intention to use that system, the perceived usefulness of that system, or the ease of use of that system. And the focus has really been on the technology rather than on the content. And there's a lot of theory there, but the application has been limited. So again, there's these disciplines that have been somewhat a little bit more separate. So we really need to try to kind of help them bring together. So this was really what informed my research. And, as Larry mentioned, I've worked on providing access to biodiversity data and information for many decades. And I really felt that although we've been providing access to the data, we really needed to try to learn more about the users. And a lot of our applications, at least where I work, have been to like usually some of the biggest constituents have been researchers and people that work in natural resource. So that's really what I really was interested in this. And in terms of biodiversity data users, there's a lot known about academic researchers, but we really didn't have much information about those that are not in academia. And in addition, there's been a lot of studies on biodiversity, individual information systems or online databases, but a lot of those reports are kept internal and are not published. So again, when you're trying to get a broader picture, it's not as easy. And that was really what I want to set out to do. I really wanted to kind of understand how data is being reused and how these online systems are being used, in particular to non-academic. And I wanted to compare them with academics because we at least know something about how they're using some of that data and how they go about looking for those data. So what I did was that the scope of my research was really on these two populations of study, what I call the academic professionals. And they really were, people that work at doctoral universities with high research activity. That was the subset of from my sampling scheme. And for government professionals were those that work at state and federal natural resource agencies. And I focused on species occurrence data because that's one of the most basic types of biodiversity data out there. And also because that's been what has been shared for a long time, since really a lot of these activities, national activities to share data started. So I decided to focus on those ones that we already had at least a good grasp of what's out there. Now, to give you, before we continue, I just want to briefly give some definitions. This may be straightforward to you, but just in case, I'm still going to provide it. And by species occurrence data, I mean data about the occurrence of an organism really at a location in time or point in time. And data reuse, it's really the secondary use of data. That is, use of data that were originally collected by someone else for a different type of project, from which the current user is trying to use the data for. And online databases, which in my instruments, I actually call them web-based information systems. They're really the databases and the data retrieval systems or applications that really provide allow people to discover, to access, visualize, summarize, and download the species occurrence data over the internet and online. So the questions that I really wanted to address was, the big thing was how similar or different are academic and government professionals on their reuse of species occurrence data and online databases. And what I'll provide here is some overview in terms of who those users were, how they're reusing species occurrence data in terms of preferred data types and sources of data, how aware are they about some of the online databases, and how easy or difficult it has been for some of them to use those databases. And also wanted to touch a little bit on the end results that come from those online databases. Like I said, we know a lot about academia, but although we had an inkling and some information about non-academics, I think they really wanted to try to get at that. And then also I wanted to couch that all into the broader data reuse process, because really the web, online resources and data is really part of that broader data reuse process. And people might be getting the data from the web, or they might be getting the data from books or other sources. So with that, I'll start with some of with some of my methods. And the methods that I use to collect data I used an online survey and I used semi-structured interviews. The survey I did just really to quantify and try to generalize to the two populations, of study, the academic and the government participants. So it was administered in 2017. I had over 900 plus participants. Really, we had a 15% response rate. So I really emailed like over 7,000 invitations for people to participate in the survey. It was done nationwide, and it consisted of close-ended questions, which were Likert type items. For example, from something that good to bad, easy to difficult, and that is a Likert type item kind of questions, in which I actually provided some categories already that the participant just had to click and select on those. But I also had open-ended questions because there were many topics that I really wanted to explore more, and I really wasn't sure about all the potential, categories. So that was for that one. And And additional information about the survey, you can find it under this paper that published Martin Mora et al. In 2020. Now, the semi-structured interviews, they're really meant for like trying to get more in-depth understanding of some of these processes and the whys, the reasons why or how they were doing certain things, because that was harder to actually gather through an online survey. If they were conducted in 2016, so the data is, by now it's a little bit old, but I still feel that the data provide a good baseline for which we can in the future actually look at how things are varying or even explore more of this stuff. And the interviews, I had 27 participants and they were located in Florida and Georgia. I did in-person interviews, so I actually went to the location of the participants where they worked. And it really consisted of open-ended questions, really to identify and explore some of the topics that I had that I really wanted to learn about, and also to probe emergent unexpected topics. So that is what the semi-structured interviews are. Now, the way I analyze the data, I really use mixed methods, and I use both quantitative and qualitative methods. So for the survey, for the close-ended questions, there were the ones where I had already given certain categorizations. The participants only had to select them. I used some, if the data was categorical, then I use chi-square test for independence, for the statistics. If they were ordinal, as into like most difficult to easiest, for example, then I use Mann-Whitney U-test and Spearman rank order correlations when I was trying to see if there were some relationships in those ordinal data. Then for the few data that were continuous in like number of hours that they use the online systems, for example, then I use t-test. All of the data was really summarized in percent frequencies by sector, that is by academia and by government. Now for the open-ended questions of the survey, the responses range from a few, a sentence to like whole paragraphs. So what I needed to do was I really needed to extract from those, that information, the things that really told me and that answer a question. And I use content analysis for that. And basically what that is that I was really looking for, what the data told me. I wasn't pretty finding any codes, but I was seeing what the data were telling me. And I started coming up with themes. And from those themes, then I developed codes. And and to really test if those codes were valid, we actually run an intercoder reliability test, and where actually I did a sampling of all the responses, and for that sample there were two coders, and we coded that sample and we compared to see if those codes match, if our coding match or not. And if they match, then I went ahead and coded everything else based on that coding guide that I developed for that question. If they didn't, then the two coders coded everything. So, and we use Cohen's kappa statistic to determine if we have reached reliability in coding or not. And again, some of those, a lot of those were categorical data, really. So, the statistics, I use the chi-square test just to test for, whether there was a statistically significant or not. Now, the interviews, again, I have a lot of information on those interviews. So I included in their analysis here transcription, because in qualitative research, the researcher it really becomes an instrument as well. And once you start reading those interviews and kind of transcribing and checking things, you start to get a feel for them, and you start to get some ideas about what the interviews are telling. So from those, I actually extracted segments that really answer some of the questions that I have for my research. And again, I developed some codes when feasible, and again, we did intercoded reliability tests when feasible. But I said when feasible because not all the data lended itself well for this. So we did it for a few questions, but not for others. And for a lot of the others, it was really more like qualitative descriptions and summaries of the data. And now, with all of these, now I'll just present to you like some of my findings basically from the research. And in this slide, what I have is the mode, that is the most common value from the online survey, from the participants of the online survey. And they were kind of similar in terms of gender, age, and year of last degree, and region of residence between academics and government participants. Most participants tended to be male, there was a ratio of 3 to 2 male to female. In age, they were also somewhat similar too, tended to be between 41 and 50 years of age. So these folks were really actually experienced. They have some experience with using species occurrence data. So that is something to keep in mind. In terms of the year of last degree, the majority had finished their degrees between 2001 and 2010. And the region of residence, they both came from the South. And this was interesting because even though it was a national, rice survey, and the at least the academic, were sampled based on like the Carnegie classification of institutions of higher education. Maybe there are more participants from the South than from other areas of the country. But where they differ, these two groups, was in their level of education. The participants in the survey coming from academia tended to have doctorate degrees, while those from government, they actually tended to have masters. 50% of them had masters, and then like 25% had bachelors and 25% had doctorates. So these two groups, the academic and government participants, also differ in their primary work area. Those in academia were really, for the most part, working on scientific research, while those in government really tended to work more like in management, conservation. They were not really doing scientific research. And so I call this the natural resource professions. In addition to that, the geographic scope of the work that they conducted, when using species occurrence data was somewhat different as well. People in academia tended to work at national and international levels, definitely more often than people in government. In the government, the people, it was at the state level where they tended to work the most, and some actually worked at regional levels as well. So that's really kind of in general who the users are, who the participants of the survey were. So these are the folks, for which I will present next, what my findings were in terms of like their use of species occurrence data and online databases. Now, for the reuse of species occurrence data, one of the questions in the survey that I asked them was, what was their preferred types, in terms of, what was their preferred types of species occurrence data to reuse? And here, both groups, both academics who are in blue and government participants who are in orange here, they tended to really prefer observational data and species registers and distribution. But even though both groups really were looking for this type of data the most, there was still a statistically significant difference between government and academia. Government, they tended to even prefer observational data more strongly. Really, that's the type of data that the majority of the participants from government wanted, versus those in academia. Then for instrument data, and that is things like remote sensing data, for example, those kind of data, they actually were very similar. There was really no difference, but there was also difference in the type of use of specimen data and citizen science data. Specimen data was used more by academic participants than government, and on the other hand, citizen science data was used more by government participants than academic. And during the interviews, what I noticed really when talking with the participants from, remember that the interviews I did to get more in depth as to the why maybe this is happening. And I know there needs to be more surveys and things for that. But what I gathered from the people I spoke in the interviews was that a lot of the people who were really using specimen data there were three things. They had either been introduced to that in school, in graduate school, at the university, they were introduced to museums. They knew about the museums, and they knew that those data could be used for a lot of things. The other thing was some of the people in government that were using specimen data were people, again, like I said, that they learned about it in school, or they knew they had a colleague, or they worked closely with somebody that had been at a museum or knew about museums and kind of helped them navigate all that world. So that was another group. And there were also people in government that at some point had worked at a museum, and they were also continued to use a lot of the specimen data in their job. Now, for citizen science data, it was more government participants who were using those kind of data. And they tended to use that because they wanted some current data, but also it was interesting because they were really going to, and by citizen science data, we have, for example, eBird, iNaturalist, those kind of systems that provide species occurrence data. And they were really they were selectively, using some records, especially those of people that they knew were good observers, or that that were trusted observers. So that's how they were really using the citizen science data, at least in government. So another question that I asked them, in the survey was, what was the preferred level of data processing that they, what was, how do they want to obtain the data for reuse, really? What kind of level of data processing? And by far here, for academics, they really want the original untransformed data. And that is not surprising. I think we all kind of knew already from previous research that people really want kind of the original data, so that they want to see what was originally collected. Now, but for government participants, they were really more divided in terms of they had a preference for original or transform, and some also had a preference for summarized, synthesized data. And and I actually looked into whether if the ones in government that wanted the original and transform were doing research, but like scientific research, but it was not. It really had nothing to do with what the kind of work that they did. So it just seems that government participants, they really like two types of data. They want the original, but they also want a lot of synthesized, summarized data, and also analyzed model data. So that is something that are, some of the findings. So keep this in mind, because for data delivery, this is actually important. Now, participants were asked also about the sources that they use to find data for reuse. And although my survey, the focus was really on trying to find about, whether they were using the web. I really provided some general questions like this, because people really could be using other media to gather data. And this is what I wanted to find from there. So here, colleagues was the biggest, and report was the biggest sources of data for government participants. And for academics, it was actually the web, and then followed by publications, and also colleagues. So, and one interesting thing here is that in previous research about academic users of data, in science, they really were using publications a lot more than the web. So, and it's possible that now they really are, the web is really even becoming a more important source for data than in previous, some of the previous research that was conducted, over the last few decades. Now, what I guess the graph that I showed you was from the survey. Now, I mean, again, some of the interviews provided me with some kind of information as to why they're going to that source. We know that colleagues was used by both, people in government and also people in academia. And, some people were going to colleagues because they were, for example, working with rare species. And they say, that data is not found anywhere else. So it's really the experts, and it's really my colleagues who has that data. So that's why I'm going to them. For some other participants, they were going to colleagues depending on their search strategy. Some people actually, they first went to a colleague, that was their search strategy. And that was usually people that tended to have that already had a network in place of colleagues, of experts that they could easily go to. So those were the ones that were going usually first to like colleagues for data. And for some others, it was really like, they may have gone to the web or to publications, but if they really couldn't find anything, then they reach out to someone else to help them find the data that they needed. And then colleague was also mentioned as part of relationship building. So some people were really going to colleagues because it helped them build relationships, so that the next time around that they really need to look for data, it's easier, and that they can also collaborate with other people. Now, in terms of the web, as to why some people were actually using that, again, it also depended on the search strategy. Some people, they might be, especially in government, they tended to use a lot of internal systems. And if they didn't have that data in-house, then they went out to the web to look for other stuff. But by far the biggest reason why people were using the web was really because of accessibility, ease of access, quick time. And like this one said, I can just right click and poof, I have it. Or it's just 2 clicks and I have it there. So it's really easy, and it's convenient. So that was one of the big reasons why people were using the web as a source for data. Also, the web was thought as up to date. I had more up to date information than, for example, books or publications. So people were going to the web for that. And also some other mentioned that it allowed them to search for things in a non-traditional way, as opposed to go to a taxonomic key. They could use images and start looking for identifying things in that way. So I mean, and these quotes really kind of summarize what was found also in the online survey, which is like the biggest reason why people are using the data sources that they use is because they're accessible. It's easier for them to access that. They also mentioned data type, and data type figure prominently into how people went about searching for data. They're searching by the specific data type and where you can find some of those types of data that they're looking for. And by data type, we mean, is it specimen data, for example? Is it geographic data, locality data? Uh, is it an invasive species or not? Different types. So that's what I mean by data type. The other reason why people were using some of those sources of data was because they're reliable. They are trusted resources, so they've used them before, so they really are going there. And also, some people really like, especially for like the web, that the greater scope. It had a lot of data. It was more comprehensive and things like that. And here again is just some quotes from the interviews. For example, somebody said, in using books, if they were not so readily available, I would probably, use more of the web. But given that they're just 3 feet from me, that I have seen, I know how to search them, then, I go and use those books. And it's because of convenience again. Some people were just going to colleagues, again, because of speed of time. They're trying to go the fastest way they can get to their data. And for some, it is actually asking colleagues. And again, for the web, because it's possible for it to be more up to date. And, so that was the part on reuse of species occurrence data. And, the people who answered those previous questions, not all of them actually use online resources. About a fifth of those who answered the data reuse questions, they didn't use online databases. And those, of course, were excluded from some of these next questions. But the next session is about people who have actually used online resources and online databases. When people who have used online databases were asked where they had learned about the databases that they really use the most, by far everybody was learning about those from colleagues, 71%. And then even web search engines and publications and conference, they were really distant. So everybody was really learning about this from the colleagues. And this also held even for those who did not use online databases, because I had some questions for those that didn't use some of those, and they had said that they really were learning about those, even though they didn't use them from colleagues. So in addition to that, mentors, which really could be almost, I could have grouped them together as, it's really a colleague, mentors. People are very important for that as well. Now, just to like the kind of web resources that people are using, and this is from the interviews. I do have data from the survey, but I'm still analyzing it, so I'm not ready to present it. But right now, the majority of people were looking into like program specific public websites and databases. That was what they were looking at to get data, the type of web resources that they use to get data. Then some people were also looking at general websites, like kind of encyclopedia type of sites, and also the search engines. In government, they really were using a lot of internal systems, so that was really important for them. And both groups were using social networks and discussion groups, especially for rare stuff. I mean, because they could actually find rare, people were posting images or said, "Hey, I found this thing in some of the Facebook pages, for example," and they could also at that point contact that person who posted that, and they had images, so they had some verification. So I believe that now probably there's even more use of the social networks and discussion groups by people who are using species occurrence data. Now, in terms of awareness of existing online databases, I actually listed some national online databases and asked people to basically put it in the survey whether they have used them, whether they have never used them but have heard of them, and whether they have never heard of those resources. Now, this slide is really for academic participants, and the next slide is going to be for the government ones. But I know it's very colorful here, but the main thing to get from this is that academic participants, they were really primarily using the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which is GBIF, the third one here, and also the Encyclopedia of Life. About 51% were using GBIF and 47% EOL. The other thing to keep in mind is that nearly half, 50% of some of these have never heard of some of these other sites. So again, just keeping this in mind, but they were using some sites more than others. Now, the next slide, which is government participants, these were actually, they were using NatureServe, 52%, and the plants, the USDA, the Department of Agriculture plants database, which was 43%. Those were the databases that they have had use of those that I listed before. And again, if you look at the blue here, I've never heard of any of these resources. Half to 3/4 of them have never heard of these resources. So this was what that kind of it's pointing to me is that maybe our outreach, for a lot of these things, we haven't really done as great a job because a lot of people really don't even know that they exist. And the other thing that it was interesting was that we really need to try to figure out, why, for example, NatureServe, the plants, GBIF, why are they used more? It's possible that these are some of the longest running online databases. Maybe it's time, right? Or maybe there's some functions, functionality that are really more geared for people to use them. But that will be for future research. Now, if you notice from the previous slide, it looked like a lot of people, there were many of the systems that they really didn't know about. And I had a series of questions in the online survey about, how easy or difficult was, for the participants, some of these aspects of database use. One of those was finding systems, and actually both academic and government were similar, and they say that it was somewhat easy. But if we look at the results from the previous slides that I showed, it seems that there's really a little bit of a disconnect between the perception of the users and what actually we're seeing with the data. So it may not really be as easy to them to find some of the systems because a lot of them they didn't really knew about. And the other thing was that the systems done by academics were usually done by academic, were usually used by people in academia, and those done by government tended to be, or other organizations that would be used more by people in government. So again, it's just something to keep in mind. But for these aspects of system use, people thought that finding systems, accessing the systems, and using the systems was actually somewhat easy, and even to a degree identifying data in those systems, in those online databases. Now, when it came to the data, actually, understanding the data in the systems or retrieving the data in a format that the user needed, that was, neither easy nor difficult. So it was kind of, a little bit more in between there. But again, both academic and government participants felt kind of the same way about those aspects of those systems. Where it was actually different, and what they both found the hardest was really trying to evaluate the quality of the data in those online databases, in those systems. And it was somewhat difficult for academics and somewhat difficult to neither easy nor difficult. And the thing was that this was actually even statistically significant different between groups. It was harder for academics to evaluate quality of data than it was for government participants. Now, there's a couple of possibilities here. It could be that they're using different systems and the data is provided in a different way. So that is one way too. But another thing that's possible, and people, previous research has mentioned that different user communities evaluate data in a different way. So maybe what the criteria that are being used and some of the things that are being used to evaluate some of the data might be different between those two communities. And I think that warrants further exploration. Now, participants were also asked about the challenges of using online databases, and this was an open-ended question. So this was one of the ones that I had to code and come up with themes and codes. But when I grouped things together, by far the biggest challenges were all related to the data. Data quality was a big one. Availability maybe of the data as well, the coverage of the data, right? And then when we look at stuff like navigation, the functionality, standardization, all that kind of stuff, download, those were system issues, and those were really pale in comparison in terms of the challenges that people are having. Another type of what I called it was user issues is really like people lacked awareness about the data. That's really because of the user, right? Or they're not as technology savvy. Maybe their degree of navigating online is not as great as some other people. So those I call them user issues. But again, the big thing is the biggest issues they're having is really with the data. And when the survey participants were asked about the benefits of using online databases, again, by far everybody, both government and in academia, it's really access and usability. Being able to access certain type of data, that's really it. That's really what they view as the biggest thing. Then I call here data quality, but it's really aspects related to quality, like the amount of data, the scope, the breadth. That was some other stuff that both academic and government participants had mentioned as being a benefit of using online databases. Some view that having the data online really allow for them to be more aware and also to disseminate that data to others and also help people with decision making. And so that was really in terms of their usage of these online databases. Now, I really also wanted to find out about the results from what resulted from their use of on these online databases, because we really want to know in the biodiversity informatics community, are we providing, is it useful for what? What are the results? How are we helping in the field, right? So I really wanted to kind of delve into this, especially from the government side of things, because we really didn't have as much information on that. So, when asked about the end results of using online databases, academics really tended to mention stuff that I classified as products. That was by far what they tended to produce. And a government, it was really a mix of almost, half and half of, basically produced products, and half were making decisions based on that data. And here I am actually kind of providing a little bit, more fine detail as to what those end results are. For example, for academia, 63% of them were producing papers. And that is expected. We already knew from previous research that a lot of the results of the use of online databases and species occurrence data is really papers. So, but they're also producing maps and also, for example, models. For government, 27% are producing papers, and I say a lot of them are reports, really. They're producing maps and also communications material for others, for the public. So they're using that for out of their use of online databases. In terms of the decisions and processes, as you could see, it's really in government where they're doing a lot of decisions with the data that people are gathering from online databases, from the species occurrence data in online databases. And they were really using those data for management and conservation, for policy and permitting, evaluation, like is this resource, has it improved, are we needed to protect them or not? And also for the academic center, in terms of decisions, the biggest type of decisions was really project planning. They're using that. And it's possible that they may have underreported that in the survey, but at least, 10% mentioned those, that they were using some of that data for project planning. And then I wanted to, one of the questions that we're asking basically in the survey was, where are the resulting products and decisions? Where can those be found? We know from previous research in academia that we can find a lot of those products, in papers, right? For example, and here for academia in blue, publications and report. Again, that is not an unexpected. We actually expected that result. But for government participants, they actually mentioned that most of those products and decisions can really be found on the web. and, some in reports and some inside their own organizations. But I think the notion that a lot of that information and decision and products can be found on the web is actually good, because we might be able to develop methods for basically, for trying to mine that in the future, how we're mining from papers. So. And, now I'm going into data reuse process, and I really wanted to couch that in this larger framework, just because really to understand use of something, we really need to look at the processes. And, from the interviews, what I gathered was that the primary data tasks that people were doing for using online databases and species occurrence data were they're trying to identify a species, they're trying to find the locality of where a species or an organism occur, and they were also trying to identify what was the current taxonomy for certain organisms. And it was interesting because for this last one on taxonomy, people were using systems, not necessarily even just to look at an ID and locality, but they wanted to know what's the latest thing that this thing is called. And a lot of them were just going to the museum site just because they couldn't figure out what was the most current taxonomy. So again, people are maybe using some of the systems, it may not have been as intended, but that's what people were actually using some of those systems for. In the interviews, the participants gave me some insight into how they went about searching. And the biggest mentioned criteria that they were, as to how they went about doing a search for species occurrence data was what I call the data type-based criteria. Again, they were searching whether it was an image, whether it was a specimen, whether it was taxonomic data, whether it's a specific geographic location or localities data. Then also some people were searching by the things that were related to the biology of the species that they were looking for. And there's, for example, is it a plant or an animal? Is it a listed species or is it a common species? Is it a native one or is it an invasive species or an exotic species? And these kind of species and biology-based criteria were really mentioned more frequently by government participants. We also had what is user-based criteria in terms of how much the user knew about something. First, did they know what that organism they were looking at was or not? Was it an identifier or an unidentified species? Was the user familiar with a specific resource or not? And these were actually the user-based criteria were mentioned more by those in academia. So in addition to search, I also asked them about, like how did you evaluate, the species occurrence data that you find? And by far, 3/4 of the participants in the interviews, they mentioned source credibility and trustworthiness. And they were basing that on whether the participant was really familiar with the data source. Or if they were not familiar with those data sources, they were asking colleagues and mentors about, their experience with those sources, or they were following the norms of professional communities of practice. If everybody in my group does it, then I'll use it as well. You know what I mean? There's an implicit trust just because others in your group are doing it that way. Then the second type of that they mentioned that how they evaluate the data is, I guess if source was not, if they didn't have that readily available, then they were actually trying to verify the data themselves. And they were either going to places that already knew had verified and vetted and curated data, or they were asking experts, for assistance with evaluating the data, or they were looking for evidence, images, specimens that could help verify those data, or they were cross-referencing multiple resources that could help confirm the data. For example, there was a sighting of a rare species here. Is it just one person or is it multiple people? Of course, if there's multiple people, then it's, you're going to trust that data point a lot more than one that is just a single point out there. And one of the interesting things during this research was when we're looking at the search and evaluation, there was a lot of overlap. People were mentioning kind of the similar things in both. And what it dawned on me is that it's really a continuum space. It is not one single space. People are moving back and forth. When I started the research, I had this conceptual model that the data reuse process had like distinct linear steps, you first search data, then you go to evaluation. But that is really not what I was saying here. People are just doing back and forth. And it's more like a web process as opposed to a linear thing. It's a web of things where they move back and forth. And in some cases, people were just only going to trusted sites. So they already have evaluated the data. And then it's just a simple search of the data that they need. So again, they're not separate, discrete, but one continuum space. And the users are moving between both. And finally, how do they decide whether to reuse something or not? It's this occurrence data point that they found. And there's really two things. They're going to trusted data, they're using trusted data, and that was the biggest one, but they are also kind of comparing that based on their project questions, goals, and resource. For example, if I have a park management plan, it's going to be scrutinized by a lot of people along the chain of command. So you want to make sure that you put that is the data that is valid and trusted. But for example, if you're teaching a class and I'm showing them some data points, if there's one or two that may not be exactly accurate, then it doesn't matter that much. So that's how they were really deciding. It's really based on the trusted, whether it was the source of data were trusted, and whether the project warranted that it be really carefully scrutinized or not. So in conclusions, what I really found was that there were more similarities, between academic and government professionals, but there were some differences. And, here again, the important thing is that the difference that I really found, they're really important for the type of data that they look for, where they go to look for those data, and how they prefer to retrieve those data. So this is really important in data delivery, because they are looking at different size. They might be wanting a slightly different type of data, and and they may even understand the data or evaluate it in slightly different ways. So and again, the biggest thing is that content it's what is most important to users. They really didn't talk much about the navigation, whatever, all these other things about the systems themselves. It's really about the data. So really, that really needs, I think, to be the focus of it, especially data quality. Everybody kept, from the survey, from the interviews, it kept pointing to that kind of stuff. And again, the users are searching and evaluating data concurrently, and they're making trade-offs really in decisions on whether or not to reuse these data. So this is really, the research, the summary of the research. And I think from here, there's a lot of, for research, there's a lot of possibilities to go. I think we need to really look more into data dissemination, how to tap into those the colleagues, the professional networks, the human networks, really, to try to disseminate information about existing online databases. We really need new methods to convey data quality and the context of the data, because this is where the users, at least the participants in my study, were really having the hardest time doing that. Also, the data quality perceptions and evaluations by different user communities. It'll be really interesting to see if they're really, that's what's going on here between government and academics, that they're really evaluating things in a different way. Again, we need to make things more usable. We need to identify ways to actually mine the web for the products and decisions from government participants. And of course, revise my data reuse model because that was not how I envisioned it. It ended up being totally different. And I think to try to integrate data more into the technology acceptance models will be great. And for those that are really developing databases, try to figure out to outreach to those professional networks, because this is where you really get the most inroad in terms of disseminating, the information about your databases. They need to be easy. The databases need to be easy to access and use. If it takes them time, forget it. They're just going to leave it, and not even. It may be the best data available, but if if it's something that takes time for them to do, they're not going to do it. So, and again, try to focus on the types of data that are provided. Allow for fine level geographic level searches, summary maps for like government folks that they really want those summaries. Try to incorporate some of the user tags into the data delivery workflows when we provide some of these systems. And of course, improve data quality and information about the context of the data. So this is really it. And, I'll finish by expressing thanks to the many people who made this research possible. First, to my advisor, Larry Page. Thank you, Larry, for for being there for me, for your guidance, and also for your patience with my research. And for all the great insights that you have. I also like to thank Sherry Alice, my co-advisor. She really provided all the behavioral and social science information. She was really key, instrumental in me being able to do some of this work. I also want to thank my committee members, Pam Saltis and Samantha Wisely. I mean, they were great also in giving me some guidance, throughout the various, meetings that we had. At SNRE, Karen Bray, oh my goodness, Karen, with all the help you provided for me to navigate the degree, that was incredible. And Dr. Reddy also for some inspiration and encouragement at the end. And of course, really the interview and survey participants who gave freely of their time. At USGS, Dr. Stinger Walla, he kind of encouraged this research when I first kind of thought about it. And Jillian Goodwin of iDigBio helped me with collecting some website information. James Colley, statistical consulting, family and friends. And of course, iDigBio provided some funding for some of the transcriptions of interviews, and through Jill's time, and also supported Larry and Shari. And USGS, they helped me with some courses and professional development, and with a partial support for some of the interviews. So with that, I'll just end the presentation. And if you have any questions, then just let me know.
Sorry, unmuted myself. Okay, so hopefully you can hear me in the classroom, but thank you, Elizabeth. That was really interesting. I appreciate that very much.
You're welcome.
Do we have time for questions?
So we are a little bit over at this point. So if people, Elizabeth, if you want to stay and answer some questions, if people want to stay and ask some questions, that's also fine. But if you have to go, that's also okay.
No, I can stay.
Okay, are there questions from the audience? One somewhere?
With the shift in citizen science data and the usage in the past couple of years, do you think that the significant difference that was found between government and academia will skew in the opposite direction, with academia using more citizen science data?
I think it is possible, because, and also, with a lot of the methods that are being used to address some of the, concerns that some people in academia tended to have with citizen science, I think it's actually possible. Like I said, just remember that this survey was conducted back in 2017. There were still some issues, but I know that I think more and more, and there's definitely since then, there's a lot more publishing by academics with citizen science. And I think like a lot of the statistical methodologies to address some of those concerns, I think they're improving. So I do agree. It's possible that we may see actually a shift in the future.
Okay, Elizabeth, I think some of the folks here might be really interested in knowing just a little bit about this national database for species of greatest conservation need.
Oh, okay.
That you're working on right now, and it's a different topic.
Yeah.
I think.
Okay. Sure.
A quick summary.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically what we're doing is the states. I don't know how familiar people are with the species of greatest conservation. The states, it's the 50, we had the states, US territories, and the District of Columbia. They each, every like 10 years or so, they develop what is called the state wildlife action plans. And they list like those species that are really, that they think that are important to conserve. A lot of those, it includes some are threatened and endangered, but a lot of them are not. And what they're hoping is that by them being included, they may get some funding to try to prevent them from becoming endangered and threatened, right? So what we do is, states have been doing the state wildlife action plans over the last like 20 plus year, but they were, when people develop their plans and they put their list in the swaps, they're actually not standardized. So what we do is we actually try to aggregate them at the national level and provide a taxonomic standardization, so that it's more comparable and it's a national level database. And so the first iteration, they were done in 2005. And, we had a group that kind of did that standardization. They also, their second state wildlife action plans were done, throughout the period of 2015. So there was another group. And the next one is going to happen actually next year, in 2025. But we just released kind of an updated version of some of the data, and we're standardizing it, and we're aggregating and then making it available so that people can actually use it for cross-state, regional, and national level comparisons. Still, if people want to know about species of greatest conservation need at one state, the best source is really the states. But it once just want to try to compare across states, across regions, and at a national level, then you can come to the website that we have at USGS for that. So that's kind of what it is. So that's the latest. One of the things that I'm working on. But in the past, I've worked on like bird conservation. It's again, we used a lot of the standards, Darwin Core. I don't know how familiar people are, but to try to standardize, schemas so that you can aggregate databases at larger levels, at broader levels, regional and national. So I hope that answered the question.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. So there's more
You're welcome.
information on the USGS website somewhere about this topic.
Mhm.
Any more questions? All right, Elizabeth, thank you very much.
No, thank you all.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.